profiteering is really about exploiting markets or systems to reap disproportionate benefits. And I think that is where this idea of externalities, where companies are putting their social and environmental cost onto society, really comes into play. But so many externalities, be they laborers in supply chains in the global south to discrimination in the US, our own backyards in many cases, were not really deeply thought of as business saving money and putting costs in society. So shifting from economics to really understand how these are constructed systems by businesses widen the scope of what's considered.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to this, our latest episode of The Conscious Capitalists, with myself, Timothy Henry, and my partner in making the world a better place through business, Raj Sisodia. Hey there, Raj.
Hey, Timothy. How is the spring in Washington treating you with your allergies?
Oh, yes, every now and then I'm going to go on mute because I'm having this big attack. Little did I know in Washington, D.C., people start getting on Claritin in March and don't go off it until November. So there you have it.
There's a product plug right there. Yes.
Yeah, there we go. Oh, wait a minute. Are we allowed to do that? No. Today we have a special guest, Chris Marquis, as the Cine Professor, the University of Cambridge Judge School of Business. Prior to Cambridge, Chris spent 17 years at Cornell, Harvard Business School, and the Harvard Kennedy School. And he writes a regular column for Forbes, and his work has appeared in the Boston Globe, Washington Post, Fortune, Time, Foreign Policy, The Hill, and Harvard Business Review. So in a lot of important popular places, as well as in many academic journals, ranging from the Academy of Management Journal, American Sociological Review, to Stanford Social Innovation Review. He's active on the lecture scene and circuit at venues ranging from the National Association of Corporate Directors and the SoCap Global to the Conference Board, Young Presidents Association, and the Business of Purpose Conference. His previous books, Better Business, How the B Corp is Remaking Capitalism, and Mao and the Markets, and a Financial Times Best Book of 2022, was published by Yale University Press. Chris, welcome to our podcast.
Timothy, great to be with you, and hello as well, Raj.
So, Chris, we're called conscious capitalists. So I want to begin with the concept of capitalism.
Sure.
And one of the things that I think we frame it within our movement as is we want to sort of celebrate and acknowledge capitalism while also working to elevate it. And in your book, you do a great job of critiquing it. And I think you're spot on in a lot of those things. One of the parts that was a little bit missing, and I'd love to get your perspective on, how do you feel about capitalism more broadly? Is there something that we need to acknowledge and celebrate, or is it really just a bad news bears story?
Yeah, so I certainly think it's not just a bad news bear story. I like the way you put that. I think there's huge power in markets, in ownership, in entrepreneurship, in business more generally, without a doubt. I think we're very aligned there. To be honest, I actually don't use the term capitalism a lot because I also think it's sort of a loaded term nowadays. So I mean, I think we're talking about many of the same things. Business, business for good, entrepreneurs innovating and creating new models for societal and environmental well-being, purpose of organizations, engagement with stakeholders. I mean, these are all, super important levers to make our world better. So I totally agree. And I think in the last part of the book, where I talk more about regenerative models and how business can be really active in defining a positive future, I think we're very aligned.
So I love that the way you begin the book. We did have David Giles on talking about Jack Welch, but you begin your book and your intro with a story about Jack Welch, and maybe begin there as a way of
Sure.
of kicking us off.
Yeah, David Giles' book recently, sort of Jack Welch, the man who destroyed Capitalism. Maybe I can't
Yeah.
remember the exact subtitle of his book. Really sort of brought that home to me. That reminded me of that story and the power of it. So yeah, so when I was a graduate student in 2000 at the University of Michigan, Jack Welch had just stepped down as CEO of GE. He was heralded as, the CEO of the century by, I think, Fortune magazine. And certainly he had led to tremendous shareholder value for GE, owners, shareholders, and I guess employees that held shares as well. However, in retrospect, his shareholder focused orientation may have created a lot of destruction around, sort of GE's relations in the community. I discuss some of the environmental issues that GE has had over the years. And so I think that, one of the things I try to do in the book and why I started with that is that, the idea of what being a, best business leader of the century has fortunately changed. And hopefully, and I think David Gella's reevaluation of how, many of the practices he had were a bit destructive, I think was a good start to that. And I think, I hope my book builds on that and underlines some of the things that hopefully when we look at the 21st century, the best business leader of the 21st century will be much more focused on purpose and stakeholders.
Yeah, I think, Chris, GE under Welch is almost a poster child for what you're talking about, right? Because
Right.
they focused resolutely on that one thing. And there were many costs, unseen costs or costs that were not absorbed by the company, whether it's the massive layoffs or certainly the environmental issues or many others. I think in the book, The Corporation and the documentary with the same name, they highlighted GE as literally having been found guilty 1,500 to 1,600 times or pleading guilty to a variety of violations like dumping chemicals into the Hudson River or bribing Defense Department officials or price fixing or a variety of things. And they paid billions in fines, $2 or $3 billion. But the interesting thing was that they kept doing those same things after paying the fine. They would keep doing that because it
Right.
was the cost of doing business. So it's kind of, I think, emblematic of that mindset. What can we get away with? How much can we externalize and keep for the shareholders? And ultimately, I think what the GE story tells us, if you look at it with the benefit of hindsight, that was not a sustainable, viable, robust business that was created in the process, right? It has now become a fraction
Right.
of what it was. But that mindset, that corrosive mindset has spread like a virus. We have so
Definitely.
many CEOs across America and abroad that now have bought into that and have been practicing it. Again, with all of the so-called externalities that you talk about.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, one example of that, the I think it's James McNerney. He was one of the people who was in the sort of race of three to replace Welch before Emmelt actually ended up being selected, and he went on and was CEO of Boeing, and
Yeah.
then Boeing has had a whole other set of problems that really show the sort of fundamental destructiveness of a shareholder first logic, not investing in innovation, not investing in production, returning tons of money through buybacks and dividends to shareholders. And look what's happened. Again, it's a model that ends up collapsing, as a result of these bad decisions. But sadly, it's one that destroys a lot of lives, be it actually literally lives in the case of Boeing, or also, livelihoods in the case of many, many other companies.
Yeah, and you see leaders like David Zaslav, Discovery, Warner, CEO, who I believe made $50 million last year, even as the company lost $3 billion. Right? And he's another Welsh protege in a sense. So I think that is certainly, I think, the backdrop to a lot of your work here. But I wanted to back up, Chris, because your background is unusual. Uh,
Yeah.
as a business professor, but you came in with a sociology PhD. And so, talk to us about your path. First of all, why did you choose to do a PhD in sociology? And then, how did you find your way to some of the leading business schools in the world?
Sure. So, Yeah, this might be too much of a sort of retrospective construction of a story, but I'll I'll give it a start. Um, so I'd worked for a while in the corporate world in financial services, and I knew that I wanted to be a professor at a business school. I mean, this was something that I felt that I had a lot to offer as far as, I had a background. I had actually worked in businesses, which is a bit rare, actually, believe it or not, for business school professors. And I felt that actually having a deep disciplinary grounding would be a useful complement to that business background. And it ended up, fortunately worked out. My first job out of my PhD, which from the University of Michigan, was at Harvard Business School. And I think that the sociology background is hugely influential to my work. And I hope, that as I push this book and other work forward, the idea of sociology as a discipline that can actually provide useful, insights on the economic world will be embraced more broadly in this book. And we're talking about sort of reassessing Jack Welch. And really, so much of the thinking around policy, around business, looks at economics from a much, looks at sort of the economics of it from a much more sort of neutral perspective, like this book on externalities. Many economists tell me, we know about externalities. We're economists. You just sort of price them and the government will take care of it. But actually, thinking about the reassessment of Jack Welch, I mean, there's a cultural, ideological, historical change perspective that, I think that just looking at the economics may not grasp. And I think on externalities, there's actually a huge amount of lobbying, communication, and sort of, accepting what's taken for granted that if we just look at it from an economics perspective, we don't actually get. So I think the, of course, we all think that what we do is, in some ways the most important and best way to see things. But I do think that having a more sociological or anthropological or culture, some sort of understanding of culture and ideology to complement the understanding of economics provides really helpful and useful insights.
I do think it's very important because if you look at the whole foundation of economics, it's Homo economicus, right? This narrow view of what is a human being. We're purely self-interested, individual, materialistic, short-term value maximizers. And that is such a distorted and narrow view of we are Homo
Right.
sapiens. Right? We are self-aware, we are altruistic, we are cooperative, we need to express love. And I think that's where your background in sociology, your understanding people individually and collectively, I think really brings a perspective that mostly is lacking in economics and in business, right? And then we create this narrow perspective about how, what business is about. I talk about it as a simplistic view of business that, so there's the simplicity on the other side of complexity, but then there's a simplistic way of thinking on this side. So that business is purely about profit and profit equals revenue minus cost. And so it's very simple, maximize revenue, minimize cost. Sell as much,
Yeah,
charge
yeah.
as much as you can, whether people need it or not, and then pay people as little as possible and externalize whatever you can onto the future or onto society. So you've made your profit, but that's not a true profit, right? Would you say that's a false profit? That is actually, as you point out, some of the data, the so-called side effects may actually be much greater than the whatever the
Definitely.
net. So are we getting a handle on managing these things, or is it still mostly voluntary at company levels, or is it?
I think we're moving in that direction, moving in a direction where we're getting more of a handle on it. I mean, I think things like the conscious capitalism movement have played, big roles in that because, it highlights things like purpose, highlights leadership, culture. I think all of those are, fundamental to helping reorient the system. I think also, in the EU, there's been a lot of recent work around policy formalizing, areas of accountability, greenwashing. And I think that, to me, it's, where I've taught in the business school has been, in management departments and strategy departments. And we see sort of policies and structures as sort of the hardware of change and culture and leadership is more the software of change. And I think that, there is, and you need both. I think there's action on both of those, lots of work that's been happening for decades and is really now, I think, getting some good traction to make things, to sort of actually, bring these ideas to light in a more fundamental way.
So, Chris, I love the title of your book, The Profiteers: How Business Privatizes Profits and Socializes Costs. And it sort of begs the
Yeah.
question because, again, very early on in your book, you bring up the difference between profit versus profiteering. And
Yeah.
I want to sort of delve into that a little bit because at the core of this discussion is this focus on this thing called profit. So how would you describe that difference? You've latched onto that word, the profiteers, the profiteering.
Yeah, and I should say too, I don't know if people can tell from my voice or the way how I look on the podcast, but I'm actually much a very optimistic, hopeful, and forward-looking type of person. The title I really focuses on the critique, which you, Timothy, in your earlier question sort of highlighted, and I think it's important to have deep critiques, to have forward-looking models that end up working. But I mentioned that as a little bit of background because actually the publisher really focused on that as the title, to be honest, because they thought it would grab readers and sort of like winners take all book. Although I think where I differ is that I really want to put forward positive, sort of a lot of positive sort of forward-looking ideas. And so this difference, profit and profiteering, profiteering is really about sort of exploiting sort of markets or systems to reap disproportionate benefits. And I think that is where this idea of externalities, where companies are putting their social and environmental cost onto society, really comes into play. And again, I do think, things like carbon emissions, we are beginning to have systems through markets and pricing that help, address some of those issues. But so many externalities, be they sort of laborers in supply chains in the global south, to discrimination in the U.S., our own backyards in many cases, are not really deeply thought of as business saving money and putting costs in society. So one of the things that I try to do, in addition to put it, shifting from economics to really understand how these are, constructed systems by businesses, widen the scope of what's considered.
So one of the things you bring up is that in a sense, profiteering is about an unfair level of profit. Well,
Right.
that begs the question, what
Yeah.
is a fair level of profit? And I know one company that's a very large family-owned business here in the US, or headquartered here in the US, their chairman at some point came along and said, hey, team, what's the right level of profit? What's a good profit? And of course, it begged the question, short-term, long-term. But I'm curious how you address the question of what is the fair level of profit?
Sure. So that is a really hard question to answer, and I think,
That's why I'm asking you.
yeah, exactly. Which is why I appreciate it. Which is why I appreciate it. I think that that's something that may have an ethical and moral component to it that I think may differ across businesses and entrepreneurs. But how I, you know, a little more tangibly discuss it and define it in the book is that these unpriced costs that society and the environment are bearing because of business production are unfair. I mean, that is something that the owners, shareholders of companies are gaining in profit at the expense of society and the environment. So just at a tangible level, how I'm defining it is it's about these externalities, and it's actually not fair that society and the environment are paying. That might be slightly different answer than maybe a business leader, who maybe actually want to invest positively in their community or their employees, may actually limit the profit, in the short term or maybe in the long term, because they have those sort of values or ethics. I think, it's two different things.
I heard Stuart Hart once say that as a good metaphor for internalizing externalities, right? What would happen if the exhaust pipe in your car opened inside the cabin? Right? That was a requirement. Then
That's
suddenly the
great.
design parameters would change, right? You have to internalize. And I also once heard at a systems dynamics course that I took at MIT, systems thinking, John Sturman said there's no such thing on this planet called a side effect. We do things and there are effects. And what we tend to do in business and pharmaceutical advertising and many things, right? We talk about the side effects and we
Yeah.
put them in fine print and say them very fast at the end, but they could be far more significant than the so-called main effects, right? So I think one way that we frame it is we're trying to get to business with a spectrum of positive effects, positive externalities. If you have externalities, they should be positive. And how can we get there? Do you think that is a viable idea, or do you think that is just too far? Or do you think we can get there? Positive, all kinds of positive
I love
externalities.
those two examples. Huge fan of Stu. I mean, who I also know pretty well. When I joined Cornell, he had retired, and I actually replaced him at Cornell. We've stayed in touch. He actually has deep ties to University of Michigan and lives in Ann Arbor, and that's where I did my PhD. So that's a great. I'm going to actually be using that exhaust example in the future. Also, I don't know John Sturman. I've seen, I know of his work. Been and has done great stuff. But I agree with him 100%. That's a great way to think of. There's no such thing as a side effect, and I think that so much of the thinking around externalities conceptualizes them as side effects, and to get to a situation where we are able to actually create positive externalities, thinking about them maybe is more, not thinking about them as side effects, I think might be a helpful way to do that. And on the positive externality point, I do, towards the end of the book, try to think about ways of how business is trying to conceptualize positive benefits. One area, it's becoming a buzzword a bit, so I don't want to overuse it, around regeneration or regenerative business, where a number of companies that I've been talking to are sort of seeing this as like, okay, here there's now a set of practices in the agricultural domain about how, if you actually are thoughtful about sort of your planting and your work with the land, you can actually, restore soils, restore ecosystems. And how can we then apply that type of thinking to production and manufacturing, to materials more generally, to, thinking about engaging with consumers in a way to sort of extend use, not promote overconsumption. So yeah, so I think it's, we need to think about the whole value chain in many ways if we're trying to think about ways to positively contribute to the society and environment.
So, Chris, I mean, so much of what you say, and Raj, so much of what you've been saying for years are so aligned around this idea of side effects and externalities. And so we know this, right? We know that our economic model today
Yeah,
is built on a bunch of
right,
19th century ideas. And we now have science
right.
that tells us a lot about these things. And yet, for all the knowledge, we're stuck in a system where we're having a discussion about wokeism versus
Yeah,
progressive socialism, and we're not having a discussion about what's needed to reform a system that we obviously know is broken. And I'm going to pin both of you to the wall on this one. And at business schools, we're not having this debate. I mean, if we can't
yeah,
have the debate within the business school, we're sure as heck not going to get it out into the political realm. Because if you guys can't get aligned on it or can't even begin to conceptualize or structure it, the rest of us are doomed. So there's
yeah.
my challenge to both of you. Chris, what's going on? Why can't
Uh,
we, even within a business school, get to the point where we're having a cogent discussion about the system change?
well, I do think actually in business schools we are, but I think, and I'll say a little bit about that. And actually, Raj and I ran into each other, actually not that long ago, just last week at Fordham Business School, which is one that I think is really taking these issues on in a really substantive way. But I think that You mentioned we're stuck, and and you talk about wokeism versus progressive, ism, which I think this whole anti-woke movement, while disturbing on many levels, actually shows that we're making progress because the extent to which there's been a sort of counter reaction, and unfortunately it is gaining traction in places, but I think that actually shows that there is actually progress being made. The fact that the right in the U.S. and other places around the world, just the EU elections are sort of anti-green. I mean, I think is emblematic of the fact that there is actually progress being made. And I think that, this is how social change happens. I mean, it's not linear. There's two steps forward, one step back. There's movements, there's counter movements. And I think in the business school, my challenge, and hopefully none of my sort of colleagues in finance and economics departments listen to this, because I'm going to, say that I think a big issue is that there's, part of systems is that people get socialized into them and they develop mindsets. And even some Nobel Prize winning economists like Joseph Stiglitz and Paul Krugman have said, economics is an ideology. It's basically a religion. It's not like the natural way the world works. However, I do think most economists and people in finance and accounting departments think that this is the natural way the world should work. And you have students who see the pathway to high paying investment banking jobs, running through those courses. So I do think that actually the areas that I'm in and the people I talk to, which are more behaviorally focused, be it in strategy or organizations or marketing areas, are deeply focused on these topics and pushing hard to actually reorient business schools and MBAs. But there's still that resistance. So I think it's, change is long and takes is hard and takes a long time. And I think we're in the midst of it.
Hello, everyone. Just a quick reminder that this episode is sponsored by the 2024 Conscious Capitalism CEO Summit. Are you ready to transform your business into a powerful force for good while connecting with world-class leaders shaping the future of business? Then you need to be at the 2024 CEO Summit. It's happening in October in Austin, and the CEO Summit is an exclusive invite-only experience for conscious leaders ready to claim their seat at the table. To request an invite or to nominate a peer, head to ceosummit.consciouscapitalism.org. That's ceosummit.consciouscapitalism.org, or check the episode's show notes. Look forward to seeing you in October in Austin. I wonder why there isn't a raging debate within business schools of what's the next gen system. Like, how do we improve, again, back to the fundamental idea, we want to improve capitalism. We want to elevate capitalism. Because if we don't, the consequences at political levels, at social levels, at environmental levels are catastrophic. And yet, it seems to be this debate of capitalism versus anti-capitalism versus, why isn't there a unified, we need to elevate, and what is it going to take? And if business schools can't take the lead in this, I don't know who else is going to within academia.
No, I mean, I hear you. And I do think, just yesterday, actually, I was on a 2-hour call about, creating a new sustainability MBA within a business school as some sort of beachhead for change, really, of the entire curriculum. One reason why I think I agree with you 100%, it's so important to do this in business schools is that, the students that come to business schools are a diverse cross-section of people around the world. And so much of the work that I do, to be very honest, like they're teaching on sustainability or ESG or climate, I mean, a lot of that is just preaching to the choir. I mean, you're just actually talking to the same sort of set of people over again. But if you can actually change a business school, this actually can create broader and wider impact. So anyways, there is work going on. Maybe I think it's too slow. It's not fast enough. But also, there are broader ecosystem level, initiatives too. So this conference at Fordham that Raj and I were at, there are, this Humanistic Management Association. There's the RBM, which is an organization trying to get responsible management into the curriculum. So there is, the FT actually is very active in convening some of these organizations, the Financial Times, and putting these topics into the next generation of rankings for business schools. And that's actually very important because rankings are very important in making sure driving student demand, which then deans and schools, listen to. So yeah, we need to move faster. 100% agree. But I do think that there is work that's going on in it.
Yeah, just to build on that, Chris, I think, yeah, I agree that change is happening, but not nearly fast enough. And I think uh, there are elective courses at most business schools where students can take, which who are already have that consciousness, right? But the core curriculum remains rooted in the old paradigm for the most part at the top schools. And that curriculum is controlled by the faculty. In business school faculty, in most places that I've been in, the finance, accounting people have a big voice in that. No? And deans come and go, but tenured faculty are forever. And so we
Yep.
are almost a victim of our own privileged position as tenured faculty. We can lock the system down and not let it evolve and adapt in the way that it needs to. And I think either we become irrelevant or we continue to pump out. I think there's some massive number of how many students worldwide go through a business management law or economics degree. It's in the tens of millions. We're still bumping out people with obsolete and dangerous perspectives, really. And so I'm a little more pessimistic on that front, at least in terms of the short term. And then, as you talked about at Fordham, the incentives and the systems for people to get promotion and tenure and all the publication uh, uh, pipelines and the gatekeepers and the journal editors and so forth, pretty much, uh, favor the existing paradigms for the most part. It's hard for junior scholars, right? And I think that's one of the challenges we have. Both of us now, I would say that I'm in my 40th year of teaching. You're probably more like 20 years in,
Wow.
but we are
Yep. Yeah.
relatively senior people in that world. I look at some of the younger scholars and I just say, wow, people are spending so much brilliance and so much effort on questions that are not either they're not important or they're potentially harmful, right? In terms of impact, positive impact of the kind that we need. So I think it's some of the newer schools, perhaps Judge, it's an old university, but a relatively new school, right? I think those, and then maybe Europe more so than the US, you have more forward looking business programs there.
Yeah, I do agree.
So it's ironic we're having this discussion, less than a week after the 80th anniversary of D-Day. And
Yes.
Chris, in your book, you cite D-Day
Yeah. Right.
and how we mobilized all these forces and
Yeah.
pulled off something the world had never seen before. And, at one level, it all came down to weather and weather forecasts, et
Right.
cetera. And that's a whole other story. However, um, why don't we? I mean, if you speak to the younger generation, and I'm going to keep pushing on this one because I don't think we're giving it as much, or we're not coming up with creative enough solutions.
Sure.
How do we get our D-Day mentality around this sense of urgency for change? We've had the hottest year in history. We have the International Energy Association coming out yesterday telling us we're going to have a global glut of oil by the end of the decade. and and yet there's still this pressure to keep and sustain the system the way it is. And there doesn't seem to be a strong countervailing force, or the countervailing forces can't seem to get organized. We don't have a Dwight Eisenhower anywhere
Right.
pulling it all together with a common enemy.
Yeah.
So what's our D-Day? What do we need, guys, to move forward on this?
It's sort of sad to say, but I do think that the climate emergencies that we're seeing are focusing attention. And again, I mean, there is going to be movements and counter movements. I think that sort of, yeah, the anti-green, anti-woke, I think is emblematic of the fact that actually, there's progress being made in that. Should it? I wish it was actually more organized. Part of the challenge is that climate is a global issue, and you have the U.S. having is different, in its thinking than the Europe, different than China. So I mean, it's definitely hugely challenging. But I do think, and this is in part, the D-Day reference, is that Eisenhower, he said that to solve big problems, you don't make them smaller, you make them bigger. And where I think this is useful for our context, and it relates to the sort of hardware and software metaphor that I gave previously, is that so many people I talk to, are focused just on reforming, markets and business, or maybe some people think, we need the state. I think that we need everything, basically. We need business, we need investment markets, we need policy interventions. And I think that, only with, looking across those and some of the self-reinforcing things that happen when you actually are able to do things in a multi-sector way, we will be able to get to some change. So I think, the more we can learn and in many ways, I think, business provides an amazing sort of incubation, innovation, refining business models, proving concepts. But to take it from a voluntary to something where every company is going to be doing it, I think we also need policy and the investment markets involved too.
Chris, to go off on a bit of a tangent here, I'm very curious about your work with the book Mao and Markets and your whole
Yes.
understanding of Chinese business, Chinese management, Chinese capitalism, which is being seen by many around the world as, wow, here's another alternative way to do it. And of course, we believe in individual freedom, political freedom alongside economic freedom. But talk about what you've learned in the process of writing that book about Mao and markets, because I don't think it's a perspective that people have.
Well, certainly, I think, China has the ability to do things a little quicker, on some of these topics. However, I think the potential risk of authoritarian systems, I mean, we're seeing this really post-COVID, how, while for 40 years, China had this gradually opening market economy, um, you know, since basically the current, leader, Xi Jinping, took over, there's been this really very much, draconian constraint on individual freedoms, on how businesses can engage, private businesses can engage in societal, affairs. And so I think that, our system of democracy, as we've talked about, quite a bit about, is it's messy, change is hard, but also I think it provides a much more robust foundation for a fair and equitable and sustainable future. So I'm even though you can point to examples of where things can be done quicker in a system like China, I think that the yeah sort of risks of authoritarianism are pretty severe.
So what did Mao have to say about that, and how are you? Because I think of Deng Xiaoping kind of being as the father of the
Right.
opening up there, right, in
Totally.
China. But you were saying that Mao also had some of his ideas are showing up today now, perhaps more so.
It's unfortunately not a positive story in many ways. And the idea of sort of Mao and markets that we put forward is that actually the early ideas of Mao, culturally and also institutionally, as far as the systems, are very, very deeply embedded in the Chinese economic model and society. And so you see the shock that people have at how hardline Xi Jinping is, but actually he's just actually pulling on a lot of the threads that were established by Mao. And Deng certainly deserves a lot of credit for opening China up. And people are shocked when they see Xi Jinping's dramatic reversal in many areas. But our theme is actually the period of Deng is the aberration, not the Xi Jinping is the aberration. So people see him as an aberration. Xi is an aberration from Deng, but we see a very sort of solid line from Mao to Mao to Xi, and so it's a lot about how the sort of deeply embedded imprint of of early systems around authoritarianism can really last and provide levers for later leaders, even in spite of a lot of reform in intervening.
So are they moving towards fascism? Is that like communism?
Yeah, I think it's definitely sort of authoritarianism on steroids, which I get fascism. I guess you could call it.
With the business sector subservient to the government and being directed by the government.
Very much so. For a long time, there was private economy developed. Uh, you know, the state or the Chinese Communist Party held the commanding heights, so to speak. Finance, telecommunications, energy. But actually, in the last number of years, there's been a number of ways in which they've reasserted control over the private economy through a number of mechanisms. And even, they redefined Marx's means of production, and actually data is now among the list of core means of production, which then obviously, makes it sort of a commanding heights type of industry. And you've seen with Alibaba and many of the other, sort of online e-commerce, how the state and the Chinese Communist Party really clamped down. I'm not optimistic about the future economic prospects of China.
Well, somewhere underneath all of that, lays this, in a sense, fundamental question about what is the responsibility of business. And obviously, in the Chinese example, we're going to an example where, it is de facto controlled, ordered, managed by the state. At the other end, if we said, we gave you laissez-faire, what is? And how would we begin to describe what the responsibility of business ought to be? Or do businesses just have no responsibility other than to deliver profit?
Yeah, well, I clearly think that businesses have responsibilities, and I think probably we all do, given our work beyond just profit. And I think it's how that gets defined. I think is up to individual sort of entrepreneurs and business leaders. But one of the things I try to focus on in a very simple level in this new book is that business is impeding on the rights and freedom of many other people in the world through pushing its externalities. And so, we have to also take into consideration the the rights of people in the world and the constituencies of the business. And I think that business should be able to earn some profit, of course, but not at the expense of the direct expense of other constituencies. And so, me personally, if I was running a business, I probably would go beyond that as far as having a purpose, beyond just shareholders. But at a very baseline level, it very much relates to, you know, not having the exhaust, taking responsibility for the exhaust in your car, to use the earlier metaphor.
Yeah, well, this, of course, plays back into this whole regenerative model and the idea of what does a regenerative business model look like. So maybe begin with what's your definition of a regenerative business model, and what do we need to do to encourage more businesses like this?
There's a number of different sort of case studies I did in for the book that really helped me think about what it actually means to be regenerative. And I think the one that really sort of helped the most was Patagonia. And Vincent Stanley, who I'm sure you probably, both of you probably know, told me that a real turning point came for the company when they started the Patagonia Provisions business. this is a business that sort of produced a bunch of food, now produces beer. And, when they learned through agriculture that they could actually, you know, give back to the land and ecosystems and soil in a positive way, this really made them think a lot about even what the mission of the company was. Because at the time, the mission of the company said something like, and do and minimize harm. And they're like, well, we really are focused on the environment, but in our mission statement, we're admitting that we're minimizing harm. That sort of doesn't make any sense. And, they changed their business model to now Patagonia's business models, or excuse me, mission is, we're business to save our home planet. So, and they've done a lot of things in their apparel business to try to, extend consumer life and repair and secondhand markets, and also through their, material. So the whole value chain they're thinking about. So as I think about regenerative business, people will not like this definition, probably, but I think about it just very much in terms of positive externalities. It's about, sustainability is very much about mitigating harm and maintaining things, but regeneration is more about actually creating conditions to actually positively give back to, be it communities, be it the natural world, be it the environment more generally. So I think it's a term that's useful, and I hope it doesn't sort of descend into the buzzword type of category, because it applies across many different aspects of a firm's engagement with broader sets of stakeholders, and it pushes companies to think about how to positively contribute as opposed to just mitigate.
Yeah, Chris, this possibility was brought home to me in a very real way when I went to India a few years ago. Both my parents come from farming backgrounds, large farms. And when I was growing up, those farms were teeming with life of every kind, right? And when I went a few years ago to our farm, I just said, wow, it feels so dead. And it just feels very different. And my brother said, yeah, all the birds are gone. The sparrows, the parrots, the crows, even the vultures are gone. The bees are gone, the butterflies are gone, the earthworms are gone. And all we have are people and monkeys for the most part, and some cows. And it's all because of the chemicals and the insecticides and the fertilizers, all of those things, the excessive use, and the soil is becoming worthless. But then he started this biodynamic agriculture, which is regenerative, right? So now he's restored the land, he's changed the way that he operates. And when I went last year, the bees are back, the birds are back, the butterflies are back, everything is coming back. So nature is resilient, I think, but it's up to us whether that happens or not, right? And I think that is where we have agency. We were responsible in a way for destroying it, but we are also the only way it's going to come back.
Yeah, definitely. That's very, very inspiring. And I do think, we need, again, the sort of the hardware and software type of thing. I mean, a number of Patagonia being one, but there's others that are involved in trying to create standards around agriculture and regeneration specifically. And it sounds very much like you're describing. It's about, the sort of livestock and broader biodiversity. It's about sort of soil conditions and land. And also it's about the people who work in those farming communities as well, because, a lot of times many, the E and the S get separated. But, in many type areas, agriculture being one, we need to be thinking about them together, about the people and the workers, but also about the environment.
So, Chris, tell us a little bit about your journey. Why did this become something? How did you get to this place where you are who you are, and these are the things that are important to you?
Yeah, good. That's a good question. It's so interesting. As I've been talking about this book, certainly the Jack Welch story, which we talked about, drew me back to my graduate program. But many people have asked me, and I had not made this connection before, but I grew up in Pittsburgh in the 1970s and 1980s. And this was the dying days of the steel industry. So I remember still the pollution that existed in Pittsburgh. I remember one of the most exciting things for me when I was young was driving into Pittsburgh with my family and seeing these factories belching out fire in smoke. This was something I was always hopeful that there would be some activity on those smokestacks. It was just sort of so interesting as a child, and sort of had a lot of stories growing up about people needing to change their shirts midway through the day because they just got so sort of covered with soot. And then also after the steel industry collapsed, there was tremendous, socioeconomic issues, and lots of sort of poverty and inequality. However, Pittsburgh has also dramatically reinvented itself and revitalized itself around, a number of industries like healthcare. There's a big IT, around Carnegie Mellon University. So I think, and I haven't fully processed it, that actually my personal background and seeing all these issues at a deep level when I was growing up have something to do with why I've been studying this so long. But yeah, but I need to. This is something I need to keep thinking about as well.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Chris, for joining us today and sharing your most recent work, the book, The Profiteers, and really the whole trajectory of your work. I think you do represent a kind of engaged scholar that I think for a lot of our business PhD students and young faculty, I think is a great model because you are engaged with the big issues of the world. You write in the leading academic journals, but you also write these books. You also have a column for Forbes. So you are engaged, and I think that's important because it needs all of our perspectives and wisdom for us to move forward. So thank you very much for the work you do and for joining us today.
Yeah, so really my pleasure. I'm, such a fan of the work that all of you do, Timothy and Raj, and so it was a really pleasure to talk about these issues with you.
Well, thank you, Chris, and thank you to all our listeners. And if you enjoyed today's podcast, please go over to Apple and give us a rating and leave a comment, and or whatever channel you're listening on, please hit the subscribe button. And thank you to Rainbow Productions for helping produce today's podcast, and to Conscious Capitalism, Inc., who is our sponsor. Now, we just mentioned Vincent Stanley of Patagonia, and he will be one of the keynote speakers at our Conscious Capitalism CEO Summit in October of 2024. So if you want to hear more about Patagonia and their story, that would be a great place to be. Thank you all, and see you next week.